Frank Sinatra bet everything on Tony Bennett. The reason was never told. Few voices in American music carried the weight of an entire era quite like Tony Bennett. Born to Italian immigrant parents in New York City, Bennett rose from poverty and wartime service to become one of the most respected singers in the history of popular music. While the world remembers him for timeless classics like I Left My Heart in San Francisco, few truly know the challenges, quiet battles, and defining moments that shaped his extraordinary career. From smoky jazz clubs to the world's greatest stages, Tony Bennett's story is not just about fame, it is about resilience, dignity, and a voice that refused to fade with time. This is the true story behind the legend, a journey of talent, struggle, and timeless grace. The smell of garlic and oregano couldn't mask the tension that hung in the cramped apartment like cigarette smoke. 16-year-old Anthony Dominic Benedetto pressed his back against the kitchen wall, listening to his mother Anna argue with the landlord through the thin door. Her voice, usually so strong when she sang Italian lullabies, now cracked with desperation as she explained why the rent would be late again. "Mama needs another week," she pleaded in broken English, her accent thicker when she was nervous. "My boy, he brings money from the restaurant. Good boy, he works hard." Tony closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. 3 years had passed since his father John's death, and those 3 years felt like 30. While other teenagers worried about baseball scores and Saturday night dances, Tony counted quarters and calculated how many hours he'd need to work at Ricardo's restaurant to keep food on the table. The landlord's voice boomed through the door, harsh and impatient. "I don't care about your boy's singing tips, lady. Rent's due Friday or you're out. Find another place to be charitable." Tony's jaw tightened. Singing tips. The man said it like music was some kind of joke, some frivolous hobby that didn't matter. But those singing tips had bought groceries when there was nothing left in the icebox. Those tips had paid for his younger sister Mary's school shoes and his brother John Jr.'s winter coat. When the landlord's heavy footsteps faded down the hallway, Anna opened the door and found Tony still pressed against the wall. Her eyes, the same deep brown as his own, were rimmed with tears she was too proud to shed. "Tonio," she whispered, using his childhood nickname. "You heard?" He nodded, pushing off from the wall and walking to the small window that overlooked the courtyard. Below, children played stickball in the narrow space between buildings, their laughter echoing off the brick walls. Once, that had been him down there, carefree and dreaming of nothing more complicated than hitting a rubber ball over Mrs. Patterson's clothesline. "I'll pick up extra shifts," he said quietly. "Maybe Ricardo will let me work lunch and dinner." Anna crossed the small kitchen and placed her weathered hand on his shoulder. At 52, she looked older, worn down by widowhood and worry. "You already work too much. When do you practice? When do you sing?" "I sing at the restaurant, Mama. People like it. They tip good when I sing." "That's not the same." Anna's voice carried a familiar mix of pride and concern. "Your voice, Tonio, it's like your papa's. Special. Music isn't just for tips. Music is for the soul." Tony turned from the window, studying his mother's face. Anna Suraci Benedetto had been the one to first recognize something in his voice, back when he was barely tall enough to reach the piano bench in their old apartment. She'd scraped together nickels to pay for singing lessons with a retired opera coach, sacrificing her own small pleasures so her son could learn proper breathing, proper pitch, proper phrasing. "The soul doesn't pay rent," Tony said, immediately regretting the harshness in his tone. Anna flinched as if he'd slapped her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. In the distance, a radio played Tommy Dorsey's latest recording, the sweet sound of a trumpet melody drifting through someone's open window. "Your papa," Anna said finally. "He used to say that music finds a way. Even when everything else falls apart, music finds a way." Tony had heard the story countless times, but he let his mother tell it again. How his father John, a tailor by trade, had filled their home with singing despite working 16-hour days. How he'd taught Tony to love melody before he could properly walk. How he'd died too young, leaving behind a family and dreams that seemed to die with him. "Papa never had to choose between music and eating," Tony said softly. Anna was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently straightening the worn tablecloth. "Maybe," she said, "maybe that's why God took him early, so he never had to see his son give up on music." The words hit Tony like a punch to the gut. He looked at his mother, really looked at her, and saw not just exhaustion and worry, but fierce, unwavering belief. Despite everything they'd lost, despite the constant struggle, she still believed in something he was beginning to doubt himself. That evening, Tony made his way through the crowded dining room at Ricardo's, balancing plates of spaghetti and meatballs while humming under his breath. The restaurant was typical of the neighborhood: red checkered tablecloths, Chianti bottle candles, and the constant aroma of garlic and basil that seemed baked into the very walls. Ricardo Torino, the owner, was a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could silence a room when he was angry. But he had a soft spot for music, and he'd been the first to suggest that Tony sing for the customers. "Hey, Tony!" Ricardo called from behind the bar, where he was polishing wine glasses. "Mrs. Castellano at table 6 wants to hear Santa Lucia again." "Make her cry like last time, eh?" Tony nodded, setting down the plates he was carrying and walking to the small, upright piano in the corner. The instrument was old and slightly out of tune, but it had character, each key worn smooth by countless fingers, each note carrying the weight of 1,000 songs. As he began to play the opening chords of the traditional Italian ballad, the restaurant's chatter gradually died down. This was the magic that his mother spoke of, the thing that made all the struggle worthwhile. When Tony sang, something happened in the room. Conversations stopped, forks were set down. Even the most hardened men from the docks would pause mid-sentence and listen. His voice, rich and warm even at 16, wrapped around the familiar melody like silk. He sang in Italian first, the way his father had taught him, letting each word carry the full weight of emotion. Mrs. Castellano, a widow who ate dinner at Ricardo's every Friday night, dabbed her eyes with her napkin as the song transported her to memories of her late husband. As Tony moved into the English verses, he caught sight of a man at a corner table who hadn't been there earlier. Unlike the other customers, this stranger wasn't eating. He sat perfectly still, a cup of espresso growing cold in front of him, his attention completely focused on the music. The man was well dressed, not flashy but expensive. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair combed back with precision. He looked like he belonged in Manhattan, not in a neighborhood restaurant in Queens. But more than his appearance, it was the intensity of his focus that caught Tony's attention. The man wasn't just listening. He was analyzing, studying, evaluating. When the song ended, the restaurant erupted in applause. Mrs. Castellano pressed a $5 bill into Tony's hand. More than she could afford, but she did it every week anyway. Other customers added their own contributions, and by the time Tony returned to the piano bench, he had nearly $15 in tips. The well-dressed stranger remained seated, still watching. As Tony prepared to sing another song, the man stood and approached the piano. Up close, Tony could see he was probably in his 40s, with intelligent eyes and the kind of confidence that came from success. "Excuse me, son," the man said, his voice cultured and precise. "I'm Jerry Wayne, talent scout for Columbia Records. Could we talk for a moment?" Tony's heart began to pound so hard he was sure everyone in the restaurant could hear it. Columbia Records. He'd seen their label on records in the music store window, on albums by artists he'd only dreamed of meeting. Yes, sir, of course." Jerry Wayne gestured toward an empty table in the back corner, away from the other diners. As they walked, Tony caught Ricardo's eye. The restaurant owner gave him an encouraging nod, but Tony could see concern there too. In their neighborhood, when well-dressed strangers showed interest in local kids, it didn't always end well. "Relax," Wayne said, seeming to read Tony's nervousness. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because you got something special." They sat across from each other, Wayne leaning back in his chair, while Tony perched on the edge of his seat like a bird ready to take flight. "How long have you been singing professionally?" Wayne asked. This isn't really professional. I just help out here, sing for tips. I work in the kitchen mostly." Wayne smiled. "Son, the way you just handled that song, that was professional. Raw, maybe, but professional. You've got natural phrasing, real emotion. Most singers your age are all technique and no heart. You're the opposite." Tony felt a flutter of hope in his chest, dangerous and exciting. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means," Wayne said, pulling out a business card, "that I'd like to arrange an audition for you at our studios in Manhattan. Nothing guaranteed, you understand, but worth exploring." The business card felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in Tony's hand. Jerry Wayne, Talent Acquisition, Columbia Records. A real address in Midtown Manhattan. "I don't have money for voice lessons," Tony said quietly. "Not the fancy kind. And I work here 6 days a week. I can't just—" "Slow down," Wayne interrupted gently. "First things first, the audition. If that goes well, we'll talk about everything else. But I'll tell you this much. I've been scouting talent for 12 years, and I know a natural when I hear one. You don't need fancy lessons, son. You need opportunity." And after Wayne left, Tony stayed at the restaurant long after closing time, helping Ricardo clean up while his mind raced. An audition at Columbia Records. It felt like something that happened to other people from different neighborhoods with different problems. "You gonna take it?" Ricardo asked as they stacked chairs on tables. "I don't know. What if I mess it up? What if they don't like me? What if they do?" Ricardo interrupted. "What if this is your chance, and you let fear talk you out of it?" Tony thought about his mother's words earlier that day, about his father's belief that music finds a way, about Mrs. Castellano crying over a song that reminded her of love and loss. "My family needs me here," he said finally. "The restaurant, the tips, they depend on that money." Ricardo set down the towel he was using to wipe tables and looked at Tony seriously. "You know what your mama said to me last week? She said, 'Ricardo, my Tonio has a gift, but I'm afraid this neighborhood's gonna bury it before anyone else gets to hear it.'" The words hit Tony like cold water. His mother, who'd sacrificed everything to nurture his talent, was afraid he'd waste it for the sake of a steady paycheck. She said that. She did. And you know what I told her? I told her that gifts like yours don't come around often. And when they do, they don't wait around for convenient timing. That night, Tony lay awake in the small bedroom he shared with his brother, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the city outside their window. Somewhere out there, in recording studios and concert halls he'd never seen, music was being made by people who'd taken chances, who'd risked everything for the possibility of something greater. He pulled out Jerry Wayne's business card and held it up to catch the light from the street lamp outside. Such a small thing, but it represented a door to a world he'd only imagined. In the bed across from his, John Jr. stirred in his sleep, muttering something about homework and baseball practice, normal teenage worries. Tony envied him that innocence, that freedom to think about tomorrow instead of next month's rent. But as he drifted towards sleep, Tony made a decision. He would call Jerry Wayne. He would take the audition. Whatever happened after that, he'd face it when it came. But he wouldn't spend the rest of his life wondering what might have been if he'd had the courage to try. "Music finds a way," his father had said. Maybe it was time to let it find him. The elevator seemed to climb forever, each floor taking Tony further from the familiar world of Queens and deeper into territory he'd only read about in newspapers. Through the building's windows, Manhattan stretched out below like a concrete ocean, filled with possibilities and dangers in equal measure. Jerry Wayne stood beside him, checking his watch with the practiced efficiency of a man who lived by schedules. 3 months had passed since that night at Ricardo's, 3 months of preparation and anticipation that had consumed Tony's every waking moment. "Remember what we talked about?" Wayne said quietly, as the elevator approached the 15th floor. Don't oversing. Let the song breathe. These executives have heard everything. What they haven't heard is authenticity. Tony nodded, though his mouth was so dry he wasn't sure he'd be able to sing at all. He'd practiced obsessively, working with a voice coach Wayne had recommended, a retired opera singer named Professor DeMarco, who'd agreed to work for reduced rates in exchange for helping with his restaurant's weekend entertainment. The elevator doors opened onto a hallway that screamed money and importance. Thick carpets, mahogany panels, and framed photographs of Colombia's biggest stars lined the walls. Tony recognized some of the faces: Benny Goodman, Harry James, singers whose records he'd studied like textbooks. Mr. Wayne, a secretary looked up from her typewriter, perfectly coiffed and professional. They're ready for you in Studio C. Wayne straightened his tie and gave Tony a reassuring pat on the shoulder. This is it, son. Everything we've worked for. Studio C was larger than Tony had expected, with a grand piano in the center and recording equipment that looked complex enough to power a small city. Behind a wall of glass, he could see several men in expensive suits, their faces unreadable as they shuffled through paperwork and murmured amongst themselves. At the piano sat a man Tony recognized from album covers, Bob Haggart, one of the most respected arrangers in the business. He looked up as they entered, offering a warm smile that helped settle Tony's nerves slightly. "You must be Anthony," Haggart said, rising from the piano bench. "Jerry's told me good things. What are we starting with?" "Body and Soul," Tony replied, his voice stronger than he'd expected. It was a standard he'd been working on with Professor DeMarco, a song that demanded. The brass elevator gates clanged shut with a finality that made Tony's stomach lurch. 24th floor, Columbia Records. The numbers above the door counted upward like a countdown to Judgment Day, each ding echoing in the cramped space that smelled of cigarettes and broken dreams. Tony adjusted his tie for the 5th time, the silk feeling foreign against his calloused fingers. The suit was borrowed from his neighbor Sal, who worked construction and had exactly one good outfit for weddings and funerals. Today felt like it could go either way. "You got this, kid," he whispered to his reflection in the polished elevator doors. But the face staring back looked more like a scared boy from Astoria than a recording artist ready to make his mark on the world. The doors opened with a mechanical wheeze, revealing a marble lobby that screamed money and power. Behind a mahogany reception desk sat a woman with pin curls so perfect they looked sculpted from brass. Her red lips curved into a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Anthony Benedetto for Mitch Miller," Tony said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Mr. Miller is expecting you, conference room B." She gestured down a hallway lined with gold records and photographs of Colombia's biggest stars. Perry Como smiled down from one frame, Doris Day from another. Soon, Tony thought, maybe his face would join them. The conference room could have housed his entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, the city sprawling below like a jazz arrangement. Complex, beautiful, and impossible to fully comprehend from any single vantage point. Mitch Miller sat at the head of a table that could seat 20, though only 3 chairs were occupied. Miller himself was younger than Tony had expected, maybe 40, with thick glasses and the air of a man who'd discovered the formula for turning music into gold. To his right sat a thin man in an expensive suit taking notes, and to his left a woman with graying hair who studied Tony like he was a specimen under glass. "Benedetto!" Miller stood, his handshake firm and brief. "Good to finally meet you. Heard the demo you sent over. Interesting voice, very authentic." The way he said authentic made it sound like a disease that could be cured with the right treatment. "Thank you, sir. I've been working—" Sit. Miller waved him into a chair across the table. "Let's talk business. You want to make records, we want to make money. Simple equation, right?" Tony nodded, though something about Miller's smile reminded him of the card sharks who used to hang around the docks in Queens. "Here's the thing, kid." Miller leaned back, steepling his fingers. "The market's changing, fast. These jazz standards you sing, the crooner stuff, it's yesterday's news. Kids want something with more energy, more pop. The woman with grey hair opened a folder and slid a sheet of music across the table. Tony glanced at the title, Mule Train. The subtitle read, A Cowboy's Lament in B-flat. "This is going to be huge," Miller continued, his eyes bright with the fever of commerce. "Frankie Lane recorded it last month, shot straight to #1. We need our own version, something to compete. Your voice has that rough quality, that working-class appeal. Perfect for this kind of material." Tony stared at the sheet music, the notes swimming before his eyes. He'd grown up listening to his father's records. Bing Crosby, Billie Holiday, the smooth sophistication of songs that told stories about real emotions. This looked like musical theater written by someone who'd never seen a real cowboy. "I don't know if this is really my style, Mr. Miller. I mean, I appreciate the opportunity, but..." "Style?" Miller's laugh had sharp edges. "Kid, style is what sells records. And what sells records keeps you in nice suits and pays for fancy apartments. You want to eat, you sing what we tell you to sing." The thin man looked up from his notes. "We're prepared to offer a 3-year contract, 12 songs per year, with options for renewal based on performance. The advance is generous for an unknown." Tony felt the walls closing in. 3 years of singing about mules and trains and whatever else struck Miller's fancy. 3 years of pretending to be someone he wasn't. But 3 years of steady money, of being able to help his mother, of maybe, just maybe, getting his foot in the door of the music business. "I need some time to think about it." Miller's smile tightened. "Time's a luxury, Benedetto. We've got 3 other singers coming in this week for the same material. Market doesn't wait for anyone to make up their mind." The threat hung in the air like smog. Tony thought about his mother, about the bills piling up at home, about all the nights he'd dreamed of this moment. But somehow, sitting in this gleaming conference room, the dream felt tarnished. "What if I could bring you something different?" Tony said suddenly. "Something that's still commercial but has more substance?" The woman with grey hair finally spoke. "Like what? There's this song, Because of You. It's got melody, real emotion. The kind of song that makes people remember why they fell in love." Miller glanced at his associates. "Who wrote it?" "Arthur Hammerstein and Dudley Wilkinson. It's been around a few years, but no one's really given it the treatment it deserves." "Hammerstein?" The thin man perked up. "Oscar's brother?" "That's right." Miller drummed his fingers on the table, the sound echoing in the vast room. "Play it." "Sir? There's a piano in the corner. Play it. If you're going to pitch me a song, I want to hear how it sounds coming from you." Tony's hands trembled slightly as he crossed to the baby grand piano tucked beneath one of the massive windows. The instrument was perfectly tuned, its keys responding to his touch with crystalline clarity. He'd learned to play on an old upright in the church basement, but this felt like speaking a familiar language with better words. The opening chords filled the room, and suddenly Tony wasn't in a sterile conference room anymore. He was in every small club where he'd ever performed, in every moment where music had been his salvation. His voice found the melody like water, finding its level. "Because of you, there's a song in my heart." The lyrics weren't just words. They were confessions, promises, the quiet conversations lovers have in the dark. Tony closed his eyes and let the music carry him, the way it always had since he was a child, singing for nickels on street corners. When the last note faded, the silence stretched like a held breath. Tony opened his eyes to find Miller staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "That's not terrible," Miller said finally, "but it's still pretty old-fashioned. Where's the hook? Where's the moment that makes teenagers want to buy the record?" "Sometimes the hook is the truth, Mr. Miller. Sometimes people buy records because they recognize something real." The woman with grey hair was taking notes now, her pen moving quickly across the page. "What kind of arrangement were you thinking?" "Simple, maybe strings but not too lush. Let the lyric breathe, let people hear the words." Miller stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. For a long moment he stared down at the city below. When he turned back, his expression was unreadable. Here's what I'm going to do, Benedetto. I'm going to take a chance on you. We'll record Because of You as the A-side of your first single. But, he held up a finger, the B-side is Mule Train. Insurance, you understand. If your ballad tanks, we've got something to fall back on. Tony felt his heart hammering against his ribs. It wasn't everything he'd hoped for, but it was something. A foot in the door. A chance to prove that authentic emotion could compete with manufactured excitement. "Deal," he said, standing to shake Miller's hand. "Don't make me regret this, kid. The recording session is next Tuesday, 10 a.m. Don't be late and don't disappoint me." As Tony walked back through the marble lobby, past the gold records and glossy photographs, he felt the weight of possibility and terror in equal measure. He was about to make his first professional recording, but on terms that felt like a compromise with the devil himself. The elevator ride down seemed faster than the trip up, and before he knew it, he was back on the street, the sounds and smells of New York washing over him like a familiar song. But something had changed. The city looked the same, but Tony felt different. Older, maybe, or just more aware of the price that came with every dream. He stopped at a phone booth on the corner and dialed his mother's number, fishing coins from his pocket as the line connected. "Ma, it's Anthony. I got some news." The recording studio felt like a church built for sound instead of prayer. Thick acoustic panels covered the walls in geometric patterns that seemed to absorb not just noise, but nervous energy. Tony stood behind a microphone that cost more than most people made in a month, surrounded by musicians who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Let's run through Because of You one more time," said Percy Faith, the arranger Miller had assigned to the session. Faith was a thin, precise man with the demeanor of a classical conductor forced to work with pop songs. He wore his distaste for the material like an expensive cologne. The string section, 12 violins, 4 violas, 2 cellos, looked like refugees from Carnegie Hall who'd taken a wrong turn and ended up in commercial purgatory. Behind them, a rhythm section of piano, bass, and drums waited with the patience of hired professionals who'd learned not to get emotionally invested in the music they were paid to play. Tony adjusted the headphones and looked through the control room window. Mitch Miller sat behind a console that looked like it could launch rockets, his face illuminated by the green glow of VU meters. Next to him, an engineer with rolled-up sleeves monitored levels while chain-smoking Lucky Strikes. "From the top," Faith said, raising his baton, "and remember strings. This isn't Brahms, keep it commercial." The opening bars filled Tony's headphones with lush orchestration that felt both beautiful and wrong, like wearing a tuxedo to a neighborhood barbecue. The arrangement was technically perfect, but it smothered the song's intimacy under layers of professional polish. Tony found his entrance and began to sing, but the words felt disconnected from his voice, as if someone else was performing while he watched from outside his body. The microphone picked up every breath, every subtle inflection, but somehow missed the soul of what he was trying to say. "Cut!" Miller's voice crackled through the talkback system. "Tony, you're holding back. I need more passion, more selling. Think Perry Como, think Vic Damone. These people are buying emotion, not just melody." The comparison stung. Como was a master, certainly, but his style was smooth where Tony felt rough, polished where Tony felt real. Trying to sound like someone else was like trying to speak in a foreign accent. Technically possible, but fundamentally dishonest. "Let me try it again," Tony said into the microphone. "That's the spirit. From the bridge this time." The red recording light flicked on, bathing the studio in the color of urgency. Tony closed his eyes and tried to forget about the orchestra, the control room, the weight of commercial expectations. He reached for the part of himself that had sung this song in small clubs, the part that meant every word. "Because of you, there's a song in my heart. Because of you, my romance had its start." This time, something shifted. The strings seemed to breathe with him instead of against him. The rhythm section found a groove that supported rather than suffocated. For a moment, Tony felt like he was making music instead of manufacturing it, but the moment was brief. As soon as the song ended, Miller was on the talkback again. Better, but still not there. I'm hearing too much jazz phrasing. This isn't a nightclub, Tony. It's radio. Smooth it out. Make it more accessible. Accessible. The word tasted like medicine. Tony had grown up believing that music's power came from its ability to connect people to their deepest feelings, to make them feel less alone in the world. But apparently, that connection needed to be smoothed out, made more palatable for mass consumption. They ran through the song 4 more times, each take technically superior to the last, but somehow less meaningful. By the time Miller declared take 7 perfect, Tony felt like he'd sung the life out of a song he genuinely loved. "All right, let's move on to Mule Train," Miller announced. "This is where we separate the men from the boys." The sheet music for Mule Train looked like it had been designed by committee. Every phrase calculated for maximum commercial impact, every word chosen to evoke images of rugged American individualism that most listeners had only seen in movies. Tony studied the lyrics and tried to find some connection to his own experience, some way to make the words feel honest. The arrangement was bigger, brasher, with a rhythm that galloped like its subject matter. Trumpets blazed, drums thundered, and Tony was expected to ride the musical bronco with the enthusiasm of a real cowboy. "Remember," Miller said through the talkback, "this is the side that's going to get radio play. Don't think, just feel. Channel that working class energy." Working class energy. As if growing up poor in Queens automatically qualified him to sing about life on the range. Tony wondered what actual cowboys would think of a song written by Tin Pan Alley professionals who'd probably never been west of the Hudson River. The red light came on again, and Tony launched into the song with as much conviction as he could muster. He imagined himself as an actor playing a role, a performer giving the audience what they wanted, even if it wasn't who he really was. Mule train, clippity-cloppin' over hill and plain. The words felt like stones in his mouth, but he sang them with the gusto Miller demanded. The orchestra swelled behind him, all brass and bluster, and for a moment Tony could see why the song might be a hit. It had energy, it had hooks, it painted pictures that people could easily understand. But it wasn't him. It was a version of him that had been focus-grouped and market-tested, a Tony Bennett designed by committee to appeal to the widest possible audience. And maybe, he thought as he sang about mules and mountains he'd never seen, that was just the price of admission to the neon wasteland of Las Vegas stretched endlessly into the desert night, its garish lights bleeding into the star-drunk sky like watercolors on wet paper. Tony Bennett stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his suite at the Sands Hotel, watching the electric circus below with hollow eyes. The ice in his whiskey had long since melted, turning the amber liquid pale and weak, much like everything else in his life these days. Behind him, the telephone had been ringing intermittently for the past hour. His manager, his booking agent, his record label, everyone wanted a piece of Tony Bennett, but none of them wanted the real thing. They wanted the sanitized, commercialized version that could compete with the rock and roll invasion sweeping America like a fever. "Answer the damn phone, Tony." The voice belonged to Jerry Vale, his longtime friend and fellow crooner who'd been watching him spiral for weeks. Jerry sat on the plush sofa, his own drink untouched, concern etched deep in the lines around his eyes. What's the point? Tony's reflection stared back at him from the window, distorted by the neon's shifting colors. At 36, he looked older, worn down by the constant battle between artistic integrity and commercial demands. "They'll just tell me the same thing they always do. Rock and roll is king. Traditional jazz is dead. I need to adapt or die." The room fell silent except for the distant hum of slot machines and the muffled sounds of revelry from the casino below. Tony had performed earlier that evening to a half-empty showroom, watching couples leave mid-song to try their luck at the blackjack tables. The applause had been polite, perfunctory, the kind reserved for has-beens trying to recapture past glory. Jerry stood up, his chair creaking in the silence. "You know what your problem is, Tony. You're so busy feeling sorry for yourself that you've forgotten why you started singing in the first place." Tony turned from the window, his eyes flashing with anger. "Don't give me that inspirational bullshit, Jerry. You think I don't remember? You think I don't remember singing for nickels and dimes in Queen's restaurants just to help my mother pay rent? You think I don't remember believing that good music, honest music, could change the world? Then what happened to that belief?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Tony walked to the bar cart, his movements slow and deliberate, and poured another whiskey. The crystal decanter caught the neon light, fracturing it into 1,000 tiny rainbows. "Life happened, Jerry. The business happened. You know what my A&R guy told me last week? He said if I don't start recording more contemporary material, Columbia might drop me. 37 years old, and they're ready to throw me away like yesterday's newspaper." Jerry moved closer, his voice gentle but firm. "And what did you tell him?" Tony laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I told him to go to hell, which probably wasn't the smartest career move, but at least I still have my pride." The telephone rang again, its shrill tone cutting through their conversation like a blade. This time, Tony walked over and picked up the receiver, his voice flat and professional. "Bennett here." "Tony, thank God." The voice on the other end belonged to his booking agent, Mickey Rudden, a fast-talking man with connections throughout the industry. "I've been trying to reach you all night. We've got a problem." Tony closed his eyes, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety form in his stomach. "What now, Mickey? The Copacabana gig next month? They're having second thoughts. The owner says attendance has been down for traditional acts, and he's worried about—" Tony hung up before Mickey could finish. The silence that followed was deafening. Jerry poured himself a drink and settled back onto the sofa. "You can't keep running away from reality, Tony. The music business is changing, whether you like it or not." "I'm not running away from anything." Tony's voice was sharper now, defensive. "I'm holding the line. Someone has to preserve what's good about American music, what's real about it. If I start chasing every trend, every fad, then what's left? What do we pass on to the next generation?" "Noble words," Jerry said quietly, "but nobility doesn't pay the bills, and it sure as hell doesn't sell records." Tony slumped into the chair across from his friend, suddenly feeling every one of his 36 years. "You know what scares me the most, Jerry? It's not the money, not even the career. It's the thought that maybe they're right. Maybe I am a relic, a dinosaur trying to survive in a world that's moved on without me." The room fell quiet again, the weight of Tony's confession settling between them like a heavy blanket. Outside, Las Vegas continued its eternal party, oblivious to the crisis of faith playing out 20 floors above the chaos. Jerry leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You want to know what I think? I think you're scared to take a real risk. You talk about artistic integrity like it's some kind of shield, but maybe it's just an excuse to avoid putting yourself on the line." Tony looked up, startled by the accusation. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means maybe it's time to stop playing it safe. Stop hiding behind the excuse that the world doesn't appreciate real music anymore. Maybe it's time to prove them wrong." Before Tony could respond, there was a knock at the door. Jerry got up to answer it, revealing a bellhop with a telegram in his white-gloved hand. "Mr. Bennett, this just came for you, sir. Marked urgent." Tony took the telegram with trembling fingers, his heart racing as he tore open the yellow envelope. The message was brief, but it hit him like a physical blow. "Frank wants to see you tomorrow night. Villa Capri. Come alone. Jilly." Jerry read the telegram over Tony's shoulder, his eyebrows raising in surprise. Jilly Rizzo was Frank Sinatra's closest friend and confidant, the owner of a small restaurant that served as Frank's unofficial headquarters when he was in New York. "Jesus, Tony, what do you think this is about?" Tony stared at the telegram, reading it again and again, as if the words might change. Frank Sinatra wanted to see him. The chairman of the board, the most powerful man in show business, was summoning him to a private meeting. "I don't know," Tony whispered. But even as he said it, a small spark of hope began to flicker in his chest. "But I have a feeling my life is about to change." The next evening found Tony standing outside Villa Capri in West Hollywood, his palms sweating despite the cool California air. The restaurant was modest by Hollywood standards, but its reputation was legendary. This was where deals were made and careers were decided, where Frank Sinatra held court with an inner circle that included some of the most powerful figures in entertainment. Tony had flown in from Vegas that morning, spending the day in a state of nervous anticipation. He'd changed clothes 3 times, finally settling on a simple black suit with a narrow tie, classic, understated, respectful. The maitre d' led him through the dimly lit restaurant to a private booth in the back, where Frank Sinatra sat alone, nursing a Jack Daniels and studying the evening paper. Even in the subdued lighting, Frank's presence was magnetic, commanding. At 47, he was at the height of his power, his influence extending far beyond music into film, politics, and popular culture. "Tony," Frank looked up, his famous blue eyes appraising. "Sit down. You want a drink?" "Whiskey," Tony managed, sliding into the booth across from the legend. "On the rocks." Frank signaled the waiter, then leaned back, his gaze never leaving Tony's face. "You know why I asked you here?" Tony shook his head, not trusting his voice. "Because I've been watching you, kid, watching you struggle, watching you fight against the tide like you're trying to hold back the ocean with your bare hands." Frank's voice was measured, deliberate. "And I'll tell you something, I admire the hell out of it." Tony's whiskey arrived, and he took a grateful sip, the alcohol burning away some of his nervousness. "I'm not sure I understand, Mr. Sinatra. Call me Frank." The older singer smiled, but there was something serious in his expression. "You know what your problem is, Tony? You think you're fighting this battle alone, but let me tell you something. Good music, real music, it's never been about following trends. It's about finding something true and holding on to it no matter what." Frank paused, taking a long look around the restaurant before continuing. "I've been in this business longer than I care to remember, and I've seen a lot of talented singers come and go. Most of them chase whatever's popular, trying to catch lightning in a bottle. But the ones who last, the ones who matter, they find their own voice and stick with it." Tony felt his heart beginning to race. Where was this conversation leading? "The reason I asked you here," Frank continued, "is because I want to make you an offer. I'm putting together a tour, small venues, intimate settings, the kind of places where real music can breathe. I want you to join me." Tony's whiskey glass froze halfway to his lips. "Join you?" "As my opening act, yeah. But more than that." Frank leaned forward, his intensity palpable. "I want you to show the world what real singing looks like. I want you to prove that there's still a place for quality, for class, for music that comes from the heart instead of the charts." The restaurant seemed to fade away, the sounds of other diners becoming distant background noise. Tony stared at Frank Sinatra, the man who could make or break careers with a single phone call, and tried to process what he was hearing. "Why me?" Tony finally asked. "You could have anyone. Why take a chance on someone the industry is ready to write off?" Frank smiled, but there was something deeper in his expression, a recognition, an understanding that went beyond mere professional courtesy. "Because when I hear you sing, I hear something that's almost extinct in this business. I hear honesty. I hear a man who refuses to compromise his soul for a hit record." Frank paused, swirling the ice in his glass. "And maybe because I see something of myself in you. The kid from Hoboken who used to dream about making music that mattered." Tony felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. For months, he'd felt like he was drowning in an ocean of commercialization and artistic compromise. Now, suddenly, the most powerful man in show business was throwing him a lifeline. "I don't know what to say, Frank." "Say yes," Frank replied simply. "Say yes, and let's show them what real music sounds like." Tony looked around the restaurant, at the well-dressed patrons enjoying their quiet conversations, at the servers moving efficiently between tables, at the world continuing to turn outside the bubble of this moment. Then he looked back at Frank Sinatra, the man who was offering him a chance at redemption, at artistic resurrection. "Yes," Tony said quietly. Hell yes. Frank's smile was genuine now, warm and welcoming. Good. We start rehearsals next week. And Tony, he raised his glass in a toast, welcome to the fight. As their glasses clinked together in the dim light of Villa Capri, Tony Bennett felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The road ahead would still be difficult, the battle for artistic integrity far from over. But for the first time, since the rock and roll revolution had begun reshaping American music, he no longer felt like he was fighting alone. The morning sun slanted through the tall windows of the rehearsal studio, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. Tony arrived early, his music case heavy with arrangements he'd spent all night revising. The space was bigger than he'd expected, a converted warehouse with acoustic tiles covering the walls and a baby grand piano sitting like a black jewel in the center of the room. He was tuning his guitar when the door opened and Frank Sinatra walked in, followed by a small entourage that moved with the quiet efficiency of a military unit. There was Nelson Riddle, the legendary arranger whose orchestrations had helped define the Sinatra sound. Bill Miller, Frank's pianist for the past decade, carried himself with the understated confidence of a man who'd played Carnegie Hall more times than most people had been to the grocery store. And bringing up the rear was Jilly Rizzo, Frank's closest friend and unofficial bodyguard, his presence both protective and reassuring. "Morning, Tony." Frank's greeting was casual, but his eyes were already assessing, taking in every detail of the younger singer's demeanor. "You ready to work?" Tony nodded, though his throat felt dry. Rehearsing with Frank Sinatra wasn't just about music. It was about entering a world where excellence was assumed, where anything less than perfection was unacceptable. "Nelson's got some arrangements he wants to run through with you," Frank continued, settling into a chair positioned to give him a clear view of both the piano and the performance area. "But first I want to hear you sing something. Just you and Bill. Something that shows me who Tony Bennett really is." The request was simple, but Tony understood the weight behind it. This wasn't an audition. He'd already gotten the job. This was Frank Sinatra trying to understand the artist he'd chosen to champion, trying to find the authentic voice beneath years of commercial pressure and industry compromise. Tony walked to the piano, where Bill Miller was already settling onto the bench, his fingers dancing across the keys in a brief warm-up. "What do you feel like playing, Tony?" "The Boulevard of Broken Dreams," Tony said without hesitation. It was a song that had meant something to him long before he'd ever recorded it, a piece of music that spoke to the loneliness and struggle that defined so much of artistic life. Bill nodded and began the introduction, his touch on the keys both delicate and powerful. The opening notes filled the studio, and Tony felt the familiar transformation that occurred whenever he stepped into a song. The gradual shedding of Tony Bennett, the person in favor of Tony Bennett, the interpreter, the vessel through which emotion and melody could flow freely. He began to sing, and immediately the rehearsal studio became something else entirely. The walls seemed to expand. The morning light took on a different quality, and the small audience of music industry veterans found themselves transported to the smoky nightclubs and lonely city streets that lived in the heart of the song. Tony's voice was different from Frank's, warmer, more conversational, with a vulnerability that complemented rather than competed with Sinatra's commanding presence. Where Frank wielded his voice like a precision instrument, Tony used his as a confessional. Frank Sinatra. Bet everything on Tony Bennett. The reason was never told. Chapter 16. The Crossroads of Trust. New York City, 1965. The rain hammered against the windows of the Essex house with the persistence of a broken record, each drop marking time like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Tony Bennett stood in his suite on the 32nd floor, watching the city blur into impressionist streaks of yellow and red below. The smell of cigarettes and coffee hung in the air, remnants of a meeting that had ended an hour ago, but still felt present in every corner of the room. His manager, Ray Muscarella, had left behind more than just ash in the crystal tray. The contract spread across the mahogany coffee table represented a fork in the road so sharp it could cut. On one side lay Columbia Records' ultimatum: embrace the British invasion sound, record covers of Beatles songs, modernize or be forgotten. On the other side sat an unsigned document, Frank Sinatra's personal invitation to join Reprise Records, with complete artistic control guaranteed. Tony's fingers traced the edge of Sinatra's letter, handwritten on ivory paper with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his own judgment. "Tony," it read, "the music business is changing, but real music, the kind that touches souls instead of just ears, that's eternal. Come home to where you belong. FS." The phone rang, sharp and insistent. Tony let it ring 3 times before answering, knowing already who it would be. "Mr. Bennett, this is Goddard Lieberson." The voice of Columbia Records' president carried the weight of an empire built on hit records and broken dreams. "I trust you've had time to review our proposal." "I've read it," Tony replied, his voice carefully neutral. "And the Beatles covers alone could put you back at the top of the charts. Yesterday, with your interpretation, imagine the possibilities." Tony closed his eyes. He could imagine it all too well. The session musicians trying to sound like John, Paul, George and Ringo, the overdubbed harmonies. His voice polished and packaged, singing words that belonged to someone else's generation, someone else's truth. "Goddard, can I ask you something?" "Of course. When you signed me to Columbia, what did you hear in my voice?" A pause, the kind of pause that speaks volumes. "I heard commercial potential, Tony, star quality, the ability to adapt and grow with the times. Not authenticity. Authenticity doesn't sell records in 1965, Tony. Relevance does. The Supremes, the Four Tops, the Rolling Stones, that's what moves units. That's what puts artists on television, in movies, in the public consciousness." Tony walked to the window again, pressing his palm against the cool glass. Somewhere out there in the maze of Manhattan, Frank Sinatra was probably in a studio or a club, singing the songs that had defined American elegance for 2 decades, still drawing crowds, still commanding respect, still refusing to chase trends. "What if you're wrong?" Tony asked quietly. "Wrong about what? What if authenticity is the only thing that lasts? What if all this—" He gestured at the contracts, though Lieberson couldn't see him. "What if it's just noise and the real music, the songs that matter, they survive because they're true, not because they're current?" Lieberson's laugh was sharp, businesslike. "Tony, sentiment is lovely, but it doesn't pay the bills. Your last album barely cracked the top 100. The world is changing, and you can change with it or be left behind. Those are your choices." After the call ended, Tony poured himself a scotch, Johnny Walker Black, the same brand Frank always ordered. He thought about the conversation they'd had just 3 weeks ago at the Copa, when Frank had leaned across the table after his set, his blue eyes intense in the dim light. "You know what separates the pros from the pretenders, kid?" Frank had said, swirling his drink. "The pretenders think the audience is stupid. They think people want to be lied to, fed whatever's easy to swallow. But the pros, we know better. We know people can handle the truth, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts." The memory felt prophetic now. Tony had watched Frank's career weather every storm. The Bobby Soxer hysteria of the 40s, the lean years of the early 50s when everyone said he was finished, the comeback that redefined what a comeback could be. Through it all, Frank had never tried to be anything other than Frank Sinatra. He had evolved, certainly, but never at the expense of his core identity. The door buzzed. Room service probably, though Tony hadn't ordered anything. He opened it to find a young man in a Columbia Records jacket holding a package. "Mr. Bennett, Mr. Lieberson asked me to deliver this personally." Inside the package was a 45 RPM record, a demo of Yesterday, arranged for Tony's voice. The orchestration was lush, professional, completely soulless. A note was paperclipped to the sleeve. "This is what success sounds like in 1965. Last chance. GL. Tony played the demo once, then sat in silence for a long time. The rain had stopped, and evening was settling over the city like a gentle blanket. From somewhere in the building, he could hear piano music, someone playing The Way You Look Tonight, with the kind of casual mastery that spoke of years of practice, of understanding not just the notes, but the spaces between them. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he'd memorized but never used. Sinatra residence. "This is Tony Bennett. Is Mr. Sinatra available?" A brief hold, then that unmistakable voice. "Tony, my boy, I was wondering when you'd call. Frank, about your offer." "You don't need to explain anything, kid. I know what they're asking you to do. The question is, do you know who you are?" Tony looked at his reflection in the dark window. A 38-year-old man at the crossroads of everything he'd worked for. "I know who I want to be." "Then you know everything you need to know. The rest is just paperwork." The next morning, Tony walked into Goddard Lieberson's office with both contracts. He placed the Columbia renewal on the desk unsigned and handed Lieberson the Reprise Records agreement with his signature still wet. "You're making a mistake," Lieberson said, not even looking up from his own paperwork. "A career-ending mistake." "Maybe," Tony replied, "but it'll be my mistake." As he walked out of the Columbia Records building for the last time, Tony felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the lightness of being exactly where he belonged. The street bustled with the energy of a city that never stopped reinventing itself, but for once he wasn't trying to keep up. He was walking to his own rhythm, finally free to discover what that might sound like. Chapter 17. The Leap of Faith. Los Angeles, California, 1965. The California sun beat down on Sunset Strip with an intensity that seemed to melt the very air, creating shimmering waves of heat that made the palm trees dance like mirages. Tony Bennett stood outside the gates of Reprise Records, his suitcase in one hand and his future in the other. The building was smaller than Columbia's imposing Manhattan fortress, more like an elegant home than a corporate headquarters, which somehow felt appropriate for a label Frank Sinatra had built in his own image. The receptionist, a blonde woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile, looked up as he entered. "Mr. Bennett, we've been expecting you. Mr. Sinatra is in Studio A with Mr. Bowen. They're finishing up the arrangements for your first session." Tony nodded, trying to project more confidence than he felt. The decision to leave Columbia had felt right in the moment, but now, standing in unfamiliar territory 3,000 miles from home, the magnitude of what he'd done began to settle in his chest like a stone. Studio A hummed with activity. Jimmy Bowen, Reprise's head of A&R, stood before a wall of sheet music, marking charts with the focused intensity of a conductor preparing for Carnegie Hall. At the piano sat Bill Miller, Frank's longtime accompanist, his fingers dancing through chord progressions with effortless grace. And there, in the center of it all, was Frank himself, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, completely absorbed in the music. "Tony!" Frank's face lit up as he spotted him. "Perfect timing. We were just working out the arrangements for The Shadow of Your Smile. Come here, listen to this." Bill Miller's hands found the opening chords, and suddenly the studio was filled with the kind of music that made time stop. The melody floated through the air with a tenderness that spoke of late nights and long conversations, of love found and lost and found again. Tony closed his eyes and let the music wash over him, feeling something inside his chest unlock. "That's the sound," Frank said quietly, studying Tony's face. "That's what we're after, not what's selling this week or next week, but what's going to matter 20 years from now." Jimmy Bowen approached with a clipboard. "Tony, we've got you booked for 3 days next week. Full orchestra, the works. Frank insisted on Nelson Riddle for the arrangements." Nelson Riddle. Tony couldn't hide his amazement. Riddle had arranged some of the most iconic albums in American popular music, Frank's own Songs for Swingin' Lovers, Nat Cole's Love is the Thing. Working with him was like being invited to paint alongside Picasso. Only the best, Frank said, lighting a cigarette. "Look, kid, I've been in this business longer than I care to admit, and I've seen a lot of talented people get chewed up and spit out because they compromise their way to the middle. You know what the middle is? It's nowhere. It's forgettable. We're not making forgettable music here." The next few hours passed in a blur of musical conversations. They discussed tempos and keys, the difference between singing to an audience and singing with them, the importance of space in a song, the places where silence spoke louder than words. Tony found himself contributing ideas with a freedom he'd never experienced at Columbia, where every suggestion had to be filtered through layers of commercial consideration. "What about this?" Tony suggested during their work on The Good Life. "Instead of the big orchestral swell in the bridge, what if we pulled back, made it intimate, like we're telling a secret?" Nelson Riddle looked up from his score, eyebrows raised. "Interesting. Very interesting. It would make the final chorus that much more powerful when the full arrangement comes back in." Frank nodded approvingly. "Now you're thinking like an artist instead of a product." That evening, Frank invited Tony to dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Beverly Hills. The kind of place that didn't advertise, but somehow everyone in the industry knew about. They sat in a corner booth, the candlelight casting shadows that made their conversation feel both intimate and conspiratorial. "Can I tell you something?" Frank said, after they'd ordered. "When I started Reprise, people thought I was crazy. Why leave Capitol? They asked. Why take the risk? But you know what? The biggest risk is playing it safe. Safety is the enemy of greatness." Tony twirled his spaghetti thoughtfully. "I keep thinking about what Columbia said, that authenticity doesn't sell records." "They're right," Frank said, surprising him. "It doesn't sell records. It sells something much more valuable. It sells souls. It creates connections between human beings that last lifetimes. You think Strangers in the Night is going to matter in 50 years? Maybe, maybe not. But in the wee small hours, that's forever because it's true." Their conversation was interrupted by a young man approaching their table, nervous, clearly starstruck but determined. "Excuse me, Mr. Sinatra, I don't mean to bother you, but I just wanted to thank you. My grandfather played your records every Sunday morning, and when he passed last month, we played September of My Years at his funeral. It was like you were there, singing him home." Frank's entire demeanor changed. The casual confidence remained, but something deeper showed through, a recognition of the weight of what he did, the responsibility that came with the ability to soundtrack people's lives. "What was your grandfather's name?" Frank asked. Vincent Caruso." "Vincent Caruso," Frank repeated, as if committing it to memory. "Thank you for telling me that. That's why we do this, for Vincent and all the Vincents out there who need music to help them through." After the young man left, Frank was quiet for a long moment. "That's what I'm talking about, Tony. That kid didn't come up to me because I had a hit song on the radio. He came up because the music meant something to his family, became part of their story. That's what real success looks like." They walked back to the studio, where the night session was just beginning. The musicians were the best in Los Angeles, guys who had played on hundreds of albums, who could read music like literature and interpret arrangements like poetry. But more than their technical skill, Tony could sense their respect for what they were creating. "One more thing," Frank said, as they reached the studio door. "Don't try to be me, and don't try to be anyone else. The world's got plenty of imitators. What it needs is one Tony Bennett." Inside the studio, Bill Miller was playing Fly Me to the Moon, with a casual mastery that made the complex seem simple. Tony picked up a microphone, not the one set up for recording, but a dead one he could hold, while he found his way into the song. "In other words," he sang softly, letting the familiar words settle into his voice like old friends, "hold my hand. In other words, darling, kiss me." The room fell silent. Even the engineers stopped what they were doing to listen. In that moment, Tony understood what Frank had been trying to tell him. It wasn't about the notes or the arrangement or the commercial prospects. It was about the truth that lived in the space between the singer and the song, the place where technique met soul and created something irreplaceable. "That's it," Frank said quietly. "That's exactly it." As the session ended and the musicians began packing up their instruments, Tony felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the pure joy of making music for its own sake. Not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. The leap of faith was no longer just about changing record labels. It was about changing everything, including who he thought he was and who he was capable of becoming. Or Chapter 18, The Sinatra Sessions. Los Angeles, California, 1965. The red recording light glowed like a ruby in the dim studio, casting everything in warm hues that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of creativity itself. Studio A at Reprise Records had been transformed into something approaching sacred space. 24 of Los Angeles's finest musicians arranged in the Palmer House Hotel lobby, buzzed with the restless energy of industry veterans and young hopefuls, all orbiting around the annual Music Executives Conference like moths drawn to a flame that might either illuminate their careers or burn them alive. Tony Bennett sat in a leather wingback chair near the grand staircase, watching the parade of suits and dreams flow past him with the detached fascination of someone who had learned to read the subtle choreography of ambition. His fingers drummed silently against his knee, keeping time to a melody that existed only in his head, a habit that had become more pronounced over the past year as he'd found himself increasingly caught between worlds. The industry was changing faster than anyone could predict, and with each passing month he felt more like a bridge between two eras that seemed determined to burn their connections behind them. "Tony, there you are!" The voice belonged to Sid Bernstein, the promoter who had brought the Beatles to America and was now frantically trying to position himself as the gatekeeper between old-school crooning and the British invasion. His approach was urgent, almost predatory, as he navigated through the crowd with the precision of a man who had learned to spot opportunity in chaos. Bennett looked up from his contemplation, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sid, you look like a man with something on his mind. Always straight to the point. That's what I love about you." Bernstein dropped into the chair opposite him, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Listen, I've been thinking about our conversation last month, about adapting, about finding ways to bridge the gap between what you do and what the kids want to hear." The weight of that word, adapting, settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. Bennett had heard variations of this conversation dozens of times over the past 2 years, each version a little more desperate, a little more removed from the artistry that had brought him to this point in the first place. "The kids want authenticity, Sid. They can smell compromise from a mile away." Bennett's response was measured, but underneath it lay the accumulated fatigue of defending his artistic vision against an industry that seemed to mistake change for progress. "Frank taught me that. You don't chase trends, you create them by being so undeniably yourself that people have no choice but to pay attention." Bernstein's eyes lit up at the mention of Sinatra, and Bennett immediately regretted invoking his mentor's name. In the current climate, Sinatra's support could be seen as either the ultimate endorsement or the kiss of death, depending on who was listening and what they needed to believe about the future of American popular music. "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Bernstein said, leaning forward with the enthusiasm of a man who had convinced himself he was selling salvation rather than compromise. "Frank's smart. He knows the landscape is shifting, but there are ways to honor tradition while still speaking to a new generation. Look at what Johnny Cash is doing with Bob Dylan's songs, or how Ella is approaching the Gershwin Songbook. They're not abandoning their roots. They're showing how deep those roots really go." Bennett considered this, his gaze drifting toward the hotel's ornate ceiling, where cherubs and classical figures seemed to watch the proceedings with expressions of bemused detachment. There was truth in what Bernstein was saying, but also danger. The line between evolution and capitulation was thinner than most people realized, and once crossed, it was almost impossible to find your way back. "What exactly are you proposing, Sid?" A recording session. Nothing dramatic, nothing that compromises your artistic integrity, just an exploration. Some contemporary material handled with your classical sensibility. Think of it as a conversation between generations rather than a surrender to them. The proposal hung in the air between them, and Bennett found himself thinking about the young singer he had met backstage at the Copa the previous week. A kid from Minnesota who sang with his heart on his sleeve and treated every song like it might be his last chance to tell the truth about the world. There had been something in that kid's eyes that reminded Bennett of his own early hunger, the desperate need to transform personal pain into something beautiful enough to justify the suffering. "I'll think about it," Bennett said finally, and the relief that washed over Bernstein's face was almost comical in its intensity. As Bernstein excused himself to pursue other potential conquests, Bennett remained in his chair, watching the ebb and flow of industry politics with the detached fascination of an anthropologist studying a particularly aggressive tribe. The truth was, he'd been thinking about adaptation for months, not the kind that Bernstein was selling, but the deeper question of how an artist maintains relevance without sacrificing the very qualities that made them worth listening to in the first place. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Bennett looked up to see Frank Sinatra stepping into the lobby with the casual authority of a man who owned whatever room he happened to occupy. Even at a distance, Sinatra's presence changed the atmosphere, conversations becoming more animated, postures straightening, eyes tracking his movement with the fascination reserved for natural phenomena. Their eyes met across the crowded space, and Sinatra's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a micro-smile that conveyed both acknowledgement and invitation. Without a word, he began moving in Bennett's direction, his path through the crowd as smooth as water finding its way downhill. "Kid," Sinatra said as he approached, his voice carrying just enough warmth to soften the nickname that had followed Bennett for more years than either of them cared to count. "You look like a man contemplating the meaning of existence. Either that, or you've been talking to too many executives." "Both, actually," Bennett replied, rising to shake Sinatra's hand. The grip was firm, familiar, carrying the weight of shared understanding that had developed over their years of friendship and professional collaboration. "Sid Bernstein just presented me with an opportunity to save my career by destroying everything that makes it worth saving." Sinatra's laugh was sharp, knowing, Sid, the man who thinks evolution and revolution are the same thing. What did he want? Folk music with strings, rock and roll with a swing beat. Let me guess, he used the word bridge at least 3 times. 4 times, actually. Ambitious. "Walk with me, Tony. There's something we need to discuss, and this lobby has more ears than a cornfield." They made their way toward the hotel's bar, a dimly lit sanctuary where the afternoon crowd consisted mainly of industry veterans nursing drinks that were stronger than their current prospects. The conversations here moved in whispers and half-finished sentences, everyone acutely aware that careers could be made or destroyed by a carelessly overheard comment. Sinatra chose a corner booth that offered both privacy and a clear view of the room's entrances, a habit that spoke to his years of navigating the more dangerous aspects of fame and influence. He ordered scotch, neat. Bennett asked for coffee, black, earning a raised eyebrow that somehow managed to convey both amusement and mild disapproval. "Coffee at 3 in the afternoon, Sinatra observed. "You're either more disciplined than I gave you credit for, or you're planning to be up all night thinking about whatever's eating at you." "Maybe both." Bennett settled back into the booth's worn leather, feeling some of the day's tension begin to release in the familiar comfort of Sinatra's presence. There was something about the older singer's directness that cut through all the industry noise and reduced complex problems to their essential elements. "Frank, can I ask you something?" "Shoot." "When you decided to champion my career, really put your reputation behind me, what were you risking? I mean, what did you see that made it worth the gamble?" Sinatra's expression grew thoughtful, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass in a slow, meditative circle. For a moment, The question seemed to transport him somewhere else entirely, to a time and place where the stakes had been different, but the essential challenge remained the same. You want the truth, or the version that makes both of us look good? The truth, always the truth. The truth is, I saw myself, not the me that existed then, but the me that I hoped I could become. Sinatra's voice grew quieter, more intense, as if he were sharing a secret that had taken him years to understand. You had something that most singers never develop, the ability to inhabit a song completely without disappearing into it. You could serve the music without sacrificing your identity. That's rarer than you might think. Bennett absorbed this, feeling the weight of responsibility and opportunity that came with such recognition. And the risk was that I might be wrong, that you might choose the easy path instead of the necessary one. That success might make you soft, or failure might make you bitter. Sinatra took a slow sip of his scotch, his eyes never leaving Bennett's face. But there was another risk, one that I didn't fully understand at the time, which was that by supporting you, I was essentially betting against the future I thought I wanted. You represented something pure, something untainted by compromise. If you succeeded on those terms, it would prove that integrity could coexist with commercial success. If you failed, he shrugged, the gesture somehow conveying both possibility and resignation, well, it would prove that the industry had finally evolved beyond the need for artists who actually gave a damn about the craft. The admission hung between them, stark and honest, in a way that cut through years of professional politeness and mutual respect. Bennett realized that this conversation was as much about Sinatra's own artistic journey as it was about his career, that the mentorship had been a form of investment in a future where music could still matter, beyond its ability to generate revenue. So what happens now? Bennett asked. The landscape is shifting faster than anyone predicted. The Beatles changed everything, Dylan changed it again, and now there are kids with guitars who think 3 chords and an attitude constitute a philosophy of life. Now, Sinatra said, signaling the waitress for another round, you do what you were born to do. You sing songs that matter, with an honesty that makes people remember why they fell in love with music in the first place. You don't chase trends, you create them by being so undeniably yourself that imitation becomes impossible. Doom, the echo of Bennett's earlier words to Bernstein, wasn't lost on either of them, and they shared a smile that acknowledged both the irony and the inevitability of artistic influence flowing in circles rather than straight lines. There's something else, Tony, something I need you to know. Sinatra's tone shifted, becoming more serious, more vulnerable than Bennett had ever heard it. The reason I backed you, really backed you, wasn't just about talent or potential. It was about legacy, about ensuring that something worth preserving would survive whatever came next. Bennett leaned forward, sensing that they were approaching the heart of something that had been building for years. I've been in this business long enough to know that most of what we call classic is just yesterday's popular music that managed to outlive its original context, Sinatra continued. But some songs, some voices, some approaches to the craft, they transcend their moment and become part of the permanent conversation about what it means to be human. That's what I heard in your voice from the very beginning. Not just another singer, but someone who could help define what American music means for generations we'll never meet. The weight of this responsibility settled over Bennett like a familiar coat, comfortable but substantial. He understood now that his relationship with Sinatra had never been simply about mentorship or professional advancement. It had been about stewardship, about carrying forward something precious and irreplaceable in an industry that seemed increasingly determined to trade depth for breadth. So when Sid Bernstein or anyone else comes to you with proposals about adaptation and evolution, Sinatra said, his voice gaining strength and certainty, remember that they're not just asking you to change your sound. They're asking you to abandon your post as guardian of something that can't be replaced once it's gone. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young journalist who had been covering the music conference for Rolling Stone magazine. She approached their table with the confident nervousness of someone who knew she was interrupting something important, but couldn't resist the opportunity to witness history in the making. "Mr. Sinatra, Mr. Bennett," she said, her notepad and pen held at the ready. "Would you mind if I asked you a quick question about the future of American popular music?" Sinatra and Bennett exchanged a glance that contained entire volumes of shared understanding and mutual amusement. Without a word, they had reached a consensus about how to handle this intrusion into their private conversation. "The future of American popular music," Sinatra said, his voice taking on the public polish that he could summon at will, "is sitting right here in this booth. Tony Bennett represents everything that's best about our tradition while remaining completely contemporary in his approach to the craft. The question isn't whether that combination will find an audience, it's whether the audience is sophisticated enough to deserve it." The endorsement was public, powerful, and completely unambiguous. As the journalist scribbled frantically, trying to capture not just the words but the weight behind them, Bennett understood that something fundamental had just shifted in his relationship with both his mentor and his career. The gamble that Sinatra had made years earlier was being renewed, doubled down upon, presented to the industry and the public as a statement of faith that transcended personal loyalty and entered the realm of artistic philosophy. Bennett felt the full weight of that faith settling on his shoulders, and with it a clarity about his path forward that had been missing for months. As the journalist moved on to pursue other interviews, Bennett and Sinatra sat in comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts about the conversation that had just concluded and the implications it held for everything that would follow. The afternoon light filtering through the bar's small windows had grown longer, more golden, casting their corner booth in the warm glow of endings and beginnings. Outside, the music industry continued its frantic evolution, chasing trends and manufacturing moments with the desperate energy of an enterprise that had forgotten the difference between innovation and novelty. But inside that booth, two men who had learned to measure success in decades rather than chart positions continued to plan for a future where artistry and integrity could coexist with commercial viability, where the deepest traditions of American music could inform and enrich whatever came next. The gamble continued, the stakes higher than ever, but the conviction behind it had never been stronger. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Columbia Records Studio A, casting long shadows across the mahogany-paneled control room where Tony Bennett sat, reviewing sheet music with an intensity that bordered on meditation. The studio, located in the CBS building on East 52nd Street, had witnessed the birth of countless classics, and today it hummed with the anticipation that always preceded sessions where something significant might emerge from the marriage of preparation and inspiration. Across the room, conductor Robert Farnon adjusted his glasses and made final notations on orchestral arrangements that had taken weeks to perfect. The British-born maestro had developed a reputation for creating lush, sophisticated backdrops that enhanced rather than overwhelmed the vocalist, and his collaboration with Bennett represented a meeting of minds that transcend. The desert heat shimmered like a mirage across the parking lot of the Sands Hotel, where a congregation of Cadillacs and Lincolns baked under the unforgiving sun. Inside the Copa Room, however, the air conditioning hummed with mechanical precision, creating an oasis of cool sophistication that had become synonymous with Las Vegas entertainment royalty. Tony Bennett stood at the edge of the stage, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie, a nervous habit that had followed him from the poverty-stricken streets of Astoria to the glittering capital of American show business. The room was packed beyond capacity, filled with an unusual mixture of industry executives, high-rolling gamblers, and devoted fans who had traveled from across the country. Word had spread through the entertainment grapevine like wildfire. This wasn't just another Tony Bennett performance. This was the night Frank Sinatra would publicly declare his faith in a career that many had written off as yesterday's news. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and everyone in that room understood they were witnessing something that would either resurrect a legend or bury him completely. "You ready for this, kid?" Sinatra's voice cut through the backstage chatter with its characteristic blend of warmth and authority. At 41, Bennett was hardly a kid anymore. But in Sinatra's presence, he still felt like that young Italian boy from Queens who used to sing for quarters in neighborhood restaurants. Frank stood there in his impeccably tailored tuxedo, a vision of confidence and power, yet his eyes betrayed a depth of concern that spoke to the genuine friendship that had developed between the two men over the years. Bennett took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The rejections, the financial struggles, the nights when he'd questioned whether he had what it took to survive in an industry that seemed to change its mind about talent as frequently as it changed its fashion. "I've been ready my whole life, Frank. The question is whether they're ready for what I have to give." The older singer smiled, placing a firm hand on Bennett's shoulder. "That's exactly the attitude that's going to carry you through this. You see, Tony, most people in this business think success is about giving the audience what they think they want. But the real magic happens when you give them something they didn't even know they needed. That's what you do every time you open your mouth to sing." As the house lights dimmed and the murmur of conversation settled into expectant silence, Bennett felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about proving himself to the critics or satisfying the record executives who had bet against him. This was about honoring every sacrifice his mother had made during those lean years, every lesson learned from the veterans who had taken him under their wing, and every moment of doubt that had ultimately strengthened his resolve. He was about to step onto that stage, not as a desperate performer seeking approval, but as an artist who had found his voice through years of struggle and refinement. The spotlight hit him like a warm embrace as he walked to the microphone, and the applause that greeted him was thunderous but brief. This audience wanted to hear him sing, not simply celebrate his arrival. Bennett looked out into the sea of faces, many of them representing the power brokers who would determine the trajectory of his career, and felt a strange calm settle over him. He had spent so many years trying to fit into molds that others had created for him, but tonight he would present himself exactly as he was, a student of the great American Songbook, a craftsman who believed in the power of melody and lyric to touch something eternal in the human experience. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily to the back of the room without the aid of microphones that had yet to achieve their full sophistication. "Tonight, I want to share something with you that goes beyond entertainment. I want to tell you a story about what happens when music becomes more than just sound, when it becomes a bridge between hearts, across generations, and through time itself." The first notes of "The Way You Look Tonight" floated through the Copa room with the delicacy of silk scarves dancing in a gentle breeze. Yet there was nothing fragile about Tony Bennett's delivery. His voice had matured into an instrument of remarkable versatility, capable of conveying both vulnerability and strength within the span of a single phrase. As he moved through the familiar lyrics, something extraordinary began to happen in that room, the kind of magical transformation that occurs when technical mastery meets emotional authenticity and finds its perfect audience. Frank Sinatra, positioned at his usual ringside table, leaned back in his chair, with the satisfied expression of a man watching his most cherished predictions come to fruition. He had seen countless performers attempt to capture the essence of the American Songbook, but few possessed the combination of respect for tradition and personal interpretation that Bennett brought to every song. The younger singer wasn't simply performing these classics. He was having conversations with them, finding new meanings in lyrics that had been sung by countless artists before him. "He's not trying to be me," Sinatra whispered to Dean Martin, who had joined him for this special evening. He's not trying to be anyone but himself. That's what makes him dangerous, in the best possible way." Martin nodded, his own considerable experience allowing him to recognize the subtle, technical choices Bennett was making. The phrasing was impeccable, never rushed, despite the emotional intensity, and his breathing control allowed him to sustain notes that seemed to hang in the air like perfect crystals. But beyond the technical aspects, there was something deeper at work. A genuine love for the material that transformed each song from a performance into a revelation. As Bennett transitioned into "I Left My Heart in San Francisco," the song that had become his signature, despite initial industry skepticism, the audience reaction was palpable. This wasn't the polite appreciation typically offered to veteran performers coasting on past glories. This was the electric recognition that they were witnessing an artist at the peak of his creative powers. The song, which Bennett had initially been reluctant to record because he felt it was too sentimental, had evolved under his interpretation into something approaching an anthem, not just for San Francisco, but for anyone who had ever felt the pull of home, the ache of distance, or the joy of belonging. The orchestration swelled behind him, but Bennett never allowed the arrangement to overshadow the intimate connection he maintained with each listener. His eyes moved through the room, making contact with individuals rather than addressing a faceless mass, and his gestures were economical but expressive, the movements of a man who understood that sometimes less truly was more. Every element of his performance spoke to years of careful study, not just of singing technique, but of how great entertainers created genuine emotional connections with their audiences. During the instrumental bridge, Bennett stepped back from the microphone and allowed the 20-piece orchestra to showcase their own considerable talents. The arrangements, crafted specifically for this engagement, honored both the classic interpretations that had made these songs famous and Bennett's own artistic sensibilities. The musicians, many of whom were veterans of the big band era, played with the kind of passionate precision that had made them legends in their own right. Yet they never forgot their role as collaborators in Bennett's artistic vision. As the evening progressed through a carefully chosen selection of standards, "Fly Me to the Moon," "The Good Life," "Rags to Riches," it became clear that something unprecedented was taking place. Bennett wasn't simply delivering a greatest hits performance, he was presenting a masterclass in the art of American popular song, demonstrating how these compositions could remain relevant and emotionally powerful regardless of changing musical fashions. His interpretation of "Because of You," the song that had launched his career nearly 2 decades earlier, revealed new depths of meaning that even he might not have fully understood when he first recorded it as a young man desperate for his first break. The final song of the evening was "My Way," a relatively new composition that Sinatra had made famous, but which Bennett approached from an entirely different angle. Where Frank's version was defiant and triumphant, Tony's interpretation was more reflective, more contemplative, the voice of a man who had indeed done it his way, but who understood that the way had been paved with as much doubt and struggle as confidence and success. The silence that followed the final note seemed to stretch for eternity, as if the entire room was reluctant to break the spell that Bennett had woven around them. When the applause finally erupted, it wasn't the polite acknowledgement that veteran performers often receive, but the kind of thunderous ovation usually reserved for breakthrough moments in entertainment history. People were on their feet, many with tears in their eyes, all of them recognizing that they had witnessed something that transcended mere performance and entered the realm of art. The green room at the Sands buzzed with an energy that Tony Bennett had rarely experienced in his career. The electric atmosphere that follows a performance where every element has clicked into perfect alignment. Industry executives who had been skeptical just hours earlier were now lining up to speak with him, their expressions a mixture of surprise and newfound respect. The transformation in their attitudes was almost comical in its completeness, Yet Bennett felt no satisfaction in their sudden change of heart. He had learned long ago that the approval of industry insiders was fleeting and often meaningless. What mattered was the connection he had forged with the audience and the integrity he had maintained in his artistic choices. "Tony, that was something else entirely," said Johnny Carson, who had been in the audience and now approached with the genuine enthusiasm of someone who recognized exceptional talent when he saw it. The Tonight Show host had become one of the most influential tastemakers in American entertainment, and his presence at the performance carried significant implications for Bennett's future career prospects. "We need to get you on the show, not just for a song, but for a real conversation. People need to understand the artist behind that voice." Frank Sinatra materialized beside them, still riding the wave of satisfaction that came from watching his professional judgment vindicated in the most public way possible. His support of Bennett had been more than just friendly encouragement. It had been a calculated risk based on his belief that authentic artistry would ultimately triumph over manufactured popularity. Tonight had proven him right in ways that even he hadn't fully anticipated. "I told you so," Frank said with characteristic directness, though his smile softened the words. "But even I didn't expect it to be quite that powerful. You didn't just sing those songs, Tony, you inhabited them. That's the difference between a performer and an artist, and tonight you proved which category you belong in." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several record label executives, men whose opinions could determine the commercial fate of any artist's career. Their presence represented the kind of industry validation that Bennett had been seeking for years, yet now that it was finally within his grasp, he found himself approaching it with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. He had learned that success in the music business often came with strings attached, and he was determined not to compromise the artistic integrity that had brought him to this moment. "Mr. Bennett," said Harold Kaufman from Columbia Records, his tone carrying the kind of deference that had been notably absent from their previous conversations. "We need to talk about your next recording project. After what we witnessed tonight, I think we all agree that your artistic vision deserves complete creative control. No more discussions about commercial considerations. You make the music you want to make, and we'll figure out how to market it." The irony wasn't lost on Bennett. For years he had fought for exactly this kind of creative freedom, only to be told that his artistic instincts were out of step with contemporary commercial demands. Now, having proven that those same instincts could create something commercially viable, he was being offered the autonomy he had always sought. It was a bittersweet victory, tinged with the recognition of how much time and energy had been wasted on unnecessary battles. As the crowd of well-wishers gradually thinned, Bennett found himself alone with Sinatra in the quiet sanctuary of the green room. The older singer poured 2 glasses of bourbon from a bottle that had materialized from somewhere, and the two men settled into the kind of comfortable silence that exists only between true friends. Outside, the neon glow of Las Vegas continued its eternal dance, but in this moment, they were just 2 artists who understood the peculiar challenges and rewards of their chosen profession. "You know what the real victory is tonight?" Sinatra asked, his voice carrying a philosophical weight that contrasted with his usual brash confidence. "It's not the applause, or the industry recognition, or even the money that's going to follow. It's the fact that you stayed true to yourself when everyone was telling you to become someone else. That's courage, Tony. Real courage." Bennett nodded, feeling the weight of the evening's events settling into perspective. The performance had been a triumph, but it had also been a culmination, the result of years of refusing to take shortcuts, of maintaining faith in his artistic vision even when that faith wasn't shared by those around him. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, when he would have to prove that tonight wasn't an anomaly, but rather a demonstration of sustained excellence. "The funny thing is," Bennett reflected, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "I spent so many years trying to figure out what they wanted from me. It wasn't until I stopped trying to please them and started being myself that everything fell into place. Maybe that's the lesson in all of this. Authenticity isn't just an artistic choice, it's a practical one. People can sense the difference between someone trying to be something they're not and someone who's comfortable in their own skin. The recording studio at Columbia's Manhattan headquarters hummed with the kind of focused energy that accompanied significant artistic endeavors. 6 months had passed since that transformative evening in Las Vegas, and Tony Bennett had returned to New York with a renewed sense of purpose and, more importantly, complete creative control over his musical direction. The success of his Vegas performance had created a ripple effect throughout the industry, influencing not just his own career trajectory, but also the broader conversation about artistic integrity in popular music. The album they were working on represented everything Bennett had been fighting for throughout his career. A collection of carefully chosen standards performed with orchestral arrangements that honored both the song's original intentions and his own interpretive insights. The musicians assembled for these sessions were among the finest in New York, artists who understood that they were participating in something more significant than just another recording project. This was a statement about the enduring power of quality over trendiness, craftsmanship over commercialism. "Let's take it from the top of 'For Once in My Life,'" Bennett said to the orchestra, his voice carrying the quiet authority of an artist who had finally found his proper place in the industry hierarchy. The song, relatively new to the Great American Songbook, had been given a treatment that highlighted its optimistic message while maintaining the sophisticated musical complexity that had become Bennett's trademark. His approach to contemporary material demonstrated how classic vocal techniques could breathe new life into modern compositions. The recording sessions had attracted attention from musicians throughout the city, many of whom stopped by during breaks in their own schedules to witness what had become an open secret in musical circles. Bennett was creating something special, something that would likely influence American popular music for years to come. Jazz legends like Bill Evans and bebop pioneers like Dizzy Gillespie had made pilgrimages to the studio.